Hi, I'm Katie Scanlon LeBlanc, and I'm sharing the ethics of spiritual care. It's a final project with Professor Laura McGowan. It's a ministry with the aging and sick. And part of this presentation really started when I entered into chaplaincy. I had a lot of questions, and this is a very basic overview, and I'm excited to share this with you. Hi, and welcome to the Ethics of Spiritual Care. I'm Katie Scanlon LeBlanc, and this is the final project with Professor Laura McGowan, and it's with the ministry with the aging, sick, and dying. Hi, as mentioned, I'm Katie Scanlon LeBlanc, and I wanted to actually start this program, this presentation, with a moment of silence. And during this pandemic, just thinking about those not only who work and minister on the front lines, but those who have lost their lives through COVID-19. Thank you. Thank you for beginning in this quiet space. And I would ask that if you have any questions, this is really a basic overview. And if you do have any questions, maybe just to be able to jot that down, be in touch with me after the presentation. And whether you are a seasoned chaplain, whether you are someone just starting as a chaplain intern, or maybe you're a nurse who maybe has some questions about how to engage with spiritual care, with chaplaincy. Wherever you are at in your journey, I hope that maybe some of this presentation can help you. And also just to be able to work with the chaplains as a team in healthcare. So as I started a few years ago in chaplaincy, I had a lot of questions, but I wasn't really confident enough to verbalize those questions. So a lot of this presentation are some of the initial questions that I did have. And as I started out, again, I wasn't really sure what chaplaincy was, but I knew it was more than just a friendly visitor. And we'll go over more of what exactly chaplaincy is throughout this presentation. I was really interested in how did chaplaincy and spiritual care, what's some of the history of that? And it really started as a movement that emerged in the 1920s when Anton Boysen, who was the chaplain at Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, he began to experiment when using the mental hospital as a theological laboratory. I found this really interesting, and he invited students to spend their summers in the hospital, serving as ward attendants by day and meeting for theological reflection at night. And this really began the action reflection means of education, which sort of brings us to this is how chaplains are trained, which is the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, and that's really all over the country as a way for chaplain interns to engage in this process of chaplaincy. Where does spiritual care fit within the organization? And again, this is something that it's very basic questions that I had, and throughout this presentation, we'll be able to see where that and how that fits. A question that seems pretty basic, but is my faith tradition important? Well, I really thought that was kind of the most important. And the first thing I learned from my educator was that the faith tradition of your patient really is going to lead a visit. And that to me was really an eye opener. How do ethics come into play within spiritual care? And that really is our driving um, really force that will unfold throughout this presentation. And the three objectives that I have of this project. The first is to understand the need for professional code of ethics. The second is to have the knowledge of these ethical standards in spiritual care. And then, as I'd mentioned previously, to really have the confidence to ask questions when these standards are not lived out in the workplace. And before diving into the ethics of spiritual care, are there groups within this group, and how do they fit together? I think that was one of my really basic questions, which is how do I fit, and how do all these different faith traditions fit within um, this whole really umbrella of spiritual care? And as this is a quote from the impact of professional spiritual care. And its professional chaplaincy as it exists today is a result of chaplaincy groups from different religious backgrounds coming together to affirm and share common core qualifications and competencies. And really, this quote is something that will bring us through the whole presentation. And it's these programs over here on the right of the screen, the Association of Professional Chaplains, Association of Pastoral Counselors, of Catholic Chaplains, of Jewish Chaplains, the Canadian Association of Spiritual Care, as well as what is called really the gold standard, the standard of spiritual care and education, which is the ACPE. And how do ethics impact spiritual care, and why is it important? Although some overlap, what spiritual care is not. So, spiritual care ethics is not medical ethics. Again, there is some overlap, but just taking a quick snapshot of medical ethics, informed consent, the do no harm medical competence. Really, the heart of healthcare is to be a benefit, and justice, which is fairness to all and fair distribution of goods, is really the snapshot of medical ethics. And I thought that was important to just to name what that is, and then we can go into more of the focus on what is the spiritual care ethics. I thought a very important underpinning, really, of what we're speaking about here is I saw the World Health Organization has four dimensions of well-being: physical, social, mental, and spiritual. And really, the impact of professional spiritual care is really one of the balancing pieces of our well-being. Looking at spiritual care as a profession, also wanted to just ask the question, why do all professions have ethics codes? Again, a very basic question, but just to be able to go over this, and it's to define acceptable behaviors, to look at a high standard of care, a benchmark to use for self-evaluation, a framework of professional behavior and responsibilities, also occupational identity, and to really to educate others about the role, and occupational maturity standards really to grow in this occupation or ministry. And really how our spiritual care ethics lived out personally with each chaplain or spiritual care person. And really the first thing is that we're called to really care for our body, our mind, and our spirit. Chaplains are responsible for personal and professional conduct, really respect for all living beings and the environment. And a quote that really is shared in this ministry is from Genesis 1:27, which is God created human beings in his divine image and saw that they were very good. Respect for all individuals and respect for, most importantly, all faith denominations. And again, a very basic question, but one that I did have, which is, to whom do chaplains minister? Thinking very obvious would be the patients. and then the family of the patients, staff to whom we provide spiritual care, and also if the hospital or place is a place where there are chaplain interns, the chaplain interns are also part of who chaplains minister with and to. Next, we have how do chaplains minister? With respect to the patient first, promoting the best interest of the patient. And the next one, just want to spend just a moment or two setting aside personal convictions to support a patient. And the example I'm going to give, there was a patient that I was speaking with, and the person said, I'm a Wiccan. I am dealing with the occult, and really just pushed back on me and said, is that a problem for you? And I said, no. I said, whatever gives you peace, whatever gives you uh, moments of grace, whatever that is not up for me to judge. And it was at that moment that the patient really felt empowered, and the walls came down. And it was also at that moment that the patient was able to actually be honest to say that this actually wasn't giving this patient any peace. And so that was able to really open up some space. And there was a process there that I was able to be a bridge to help this person. But again, whatever my personal convictions doesn't matter. It matters wherever the patient is at. So that was an example that I did want to share. The next is understanding the imbalance of power in a relationship, and really when a chaplain or a spiritual care person comes into the room, there is a little bit of an imbalance because a patient really doesn't have a lot of control. And just understanding that imbalance is really important. And finally, maintaining a professional relationship with the patient. And this is, again, also part of the ethics of spiritual care. Hope everyone's doing okay and that you're with me here. This is, again, an overview, but the ethical standards for spiritual care slash chaplains really starts off with the ethical response to persons, to be patients, the response to colleagues, uh, also ethical response in education, as well as research, and then finally to the Spiritual Care Association. One of the big pieces of really an awareness in the chaplaincy program as a chaplain intern, understanding obviously chaplains impact people and their experiences, but I was really able to start to look at spiritual versus religious and trying to see that in some ways they're very different, and in some ways they're similar, and it really depends on the patient and where they're at in this balance. And as mentioned before, it's not about the chaplain's denomination, but where the patient is, whether they're religious, maybe they're not practicing, but that still doesn't mean that they're not in their faith tradition, or they could be spiritual and not religious, or maybe even religious and not spiritual. So there's just a whole piece of the individual experiences which is shared by the spirituality and the religion. So I wanted to put this up there because this is something that really was, again, another eye opener for me as I started chaplaincy. The Joint Commission, honestly, when I first started, I heard people talking about Joint Commission, and then I would hear the Joint Commission is at the hospital. Like, not watch out, but like just be aware. And I had no idea what they were talking about. I was like, all right, I'll be careful. And then it was a while before I realized like what the Joint Commission is. And again, this is just the process of learning and being immersed in this whole environment and realizing, gosh, there's just so much for me to learn. And I'm not going to read all of this, but I am just going to say that this was something that was, again, very much of an eye opener that the Joint Commission is, it was founded in 1951 and it seeks to improve healthcare for the public by evaluating healthcare organizations, and really that's what it does. Is it evaluates, and chaplaincy is a piece of this, piece of the whole. So I did want to mention this because that was something that was just very almost mystifying. Like, huh, what's a Joint Commission? So I will just leave that there. But that was something that is obviously very important in healthcare. Back a few slides, I had mentioned about the World Health Organization, that there's 4 dimensions of well-being, and them being, physical, social, mental, and spiritual. And just kind of focusing in here on the spiritual, the chaplains bring a high value of multi-faith engagement that's rooted in a commitment to spiritual health. So this isn't just an add-on to what the World Health Organization was talking about. It's not an add-on. It speaks to the very, very core of healthcare, of education, of criminal justice reform, of emergency services, of military service, and increasingly corporate, industrial, and business settings. And this is a direct quote from the impact of spiritual care within clinical pastoral education. I needed to highlight this because I liked how they said it's not an add-on. This is, again, speaks to the core of healthcare. For this slide, I really feel like we could spend more time here, and we don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to be able to highlight a couple of real life ethical examples happening in chaplaincy. And one of the first ones is really the right to die issues. They can be so complex, and having been, with patients and with families, there's no two examples that are the same. Everyone is unique, but there are some situations that speak to the core, and these were found in the ERD, the Ethical Religious Directives. So one of them is the standard criteria for use for determining whether to treat or not. There's 2 questions really, and one is from the perspective of the patient: does the proposed treatment offer a reasonable hope and benefit? And then will the proposed treatment impose an excessive burden to the patient or family? And I speak about the ERD, the Ethical Religious Directive. Again, that's something that I learned about. And although it says for Catholic healthcare, it is still a common shared ethical practice within all of the traditions that we talked about. So the ERD is something that is respected within all traditions. Being aware of religious practices, that is something that a lot of times chaplains are brought into. A situation where there's Jehovah Witness, and just realizing that they don't they're as a general rule do not engage with blood transfusions, and just to be able to understand that and be able to share that. Again, other considerations with having prayer rugs available, Muslims, to be able to pray facing Mecca. There was a situation where there was a Muslim body, and the patient had died, and really just trying to give the family their space and their time to be able to purify the body, before a funeral director came. Another, again, consideration, or just being aware of religious practice: sacrament of sick, sacrament of reconciliation. to be able to have a priest, you know, in a timely manner, and if that there's a situation where you know that there is a patient that, probably it might not even make the night, to be able, if there's a chaplain there, to be able to call a priest. Maybe they have a family priest, maybe they don't. Maybe they're practicing, maybe they're not. But if being a Catholic is their tradition, those would be very important, to be able to get a priest, to to be with them with these sacraments. And again, I talk about non-practicing is the reality for a lot, but that doesn't mean that they still wouldn't want a priest to have this sacrament. Or maybe they're very specific and they're saying, you know what, I am Catholic, but I don't want a priest here. And then by all means, another chaplain could come in and really do a blessing from their tradition, but that they would not be having a priest come and do the sacraments. So again, these are just situations that have come up in chaplaincy, and just to be aware of, and to really have a sense of respect for the faith traditions. We're closing in on the end here of the presentation, and again, I want to thank you for your patience and some of these, again, very basic questions that I had when I started chaplaincy, and I honestly couldn't have answered any of these at the beginning. Put on a little music in the last couple slides here, some background, quiet. So SOP, what does that stand for? Standards of practice. What are the 7 standards of practice for spiritual care? Assessment, being able to assess a patient, looking at the delivery of care. Documentation of care, that you need to document when you see a patient. That you work in teamwork and collaboration, and also balancing ethical practices, also a sense of confidentiality and respect for diversity. The piece on confidentiality, I do want to highlight. That is something that the 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 chaplain absolutely needs to um, be able to assess. When is it time to speak about if something is really wrong with the patient, as far as they might want to take their life. Obviously, you would have to say something. But if it's, sharing about, being able to process, what, I can hold this, real struggle, the patient. But if it's something that is, you think that they're unsafe, then obviously need to take that to the nurse. Um, but the confidentiality is a piece of some sacredness. But all of this standards of practice, it's really the call to faithfulness, to the patient. And that is really just something that is woven throughout this ministry. I had mentioned before on a previous slide about the ERD, about the Ethical Religious Directive. And I'm not going to read all this, but I found the ERD so important. Each of the parts, there's 6 parts that really helped to just to look at the sense of responsibility in healthcare, and that these directives, as mentioned, are also shared by, again, the ethics of the following organizations: the professional chaplains, Canadian Association of Spiritual Care, NACC is the Catholic chaplains, and the Jewish chaplain, so that the ERD is the most in-depth, comprehensive ethical resource for healthcare. And just because this is within the Catholic realm, it is still shared. And it just opened my eyes to just so many different places and spaces to really bridge the professional patient relationship, and to give the best ethical really glance at what is happening in healthcare. Just taking a moment, this last slide, just to be able to sit with just Just these different words, different experiences of grace, and really to be open to how you fit into these moments and to be open to being a bridge of healing to families, to patients, and really to assist the healthcare workers that you're with as we're all in this together. So we start the way we ended, which is just taking a moment, a quiet moment for all those who have really suffered greatly during this pandemic. Thank you for your time. And I hope that this has been maybe a little bit of an education and also just a quick invite into the world of starting off as a chaplain and all the different questions that I did have. And I still continue to grow. Thank you.